In December of 1940, an ordinary-looking British officer stood inside a canvas tent pitched amidst the trackless wastes of the Egyptian desert. His name was General Archibald Wavell. Outside, the midday sun beat down mercilessly on a barren landscape where, by all conventional military logic, the British Empire was about to look death in the face. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani had marched a massive Italian army across the Libyan border, sweeping into Egypt with over 150,000 men. They had dug themselves into a series of heavily fortified camps, a massive crescent of steel and artillery threatening to choke the Suez Canal and break the back of the British war effort. To oppose this overwhelming tidal wave, Wavell possessed a single, ragged force. It was called the Western Desert Force, and it numbered barely 36,000 soldiers. They were outnumbered more than 5 to 1. They were short on supplies, short on water, and almost completely forgotten by the political leadership back in London. Yet, within a matter of weeks, this tiny, neglected army would pull off one of the most stunning, lopsided victories in the entire history of modern warfare. They would advance hundreds of miles, shatter an empire's military ambitions, and capture over 130,000 prisoners. It was a masterclass in mechanized strategy, a campaign that should have cemented Archibald Wavell's name alongside history's greatest commanders. Instead, it became the opening chapter of a profound military tragedy. Wavell would find his ultimate victory torn from his fingers by the grand, romantic schemes of his own prime minister. He would be forced to fight a completely different war with resources he did not possess, only to be cast aside, dismissed as a failure, and replaced by men who would receive the very keys to victory he had been systematically denied. To understand the Desert War and the systematic dismantling of the man who first won it, one must look past the famous legends of the Afrika Korps and the Desert Rats. One must look into the quiet, stoic mind of a scholar general who was asked to perform the impossible on a shoestring budget, accomplished it, and was broken by the politics of total war. The weight of an empty horizon. To the political elite in London, the Middle East was a critical point on a map, a vital arterial highway of empire that could not be allowed to fall. But to General Archibald Wavell, who assumed command of Middle East Command in the summer of 1939, it was a logistical nightmare of terrifying proportions. His geographic responsibility was staggering. It stretched from the deserts of Egypt and the mountains of Greece to the oil fields of Iraq and the borders of East Africa. It was an area encompassing millions of square miles, fractured by complex political rivalries and completely exposed to hostile forces. And to defend this vast, sprawling empire, Wavell was given almost nothing. While Great Britain braced itself for an expected German invasion across the English Channel, every modern tank, every new fighter aircraft, and every spare crate of ammunition was kept at home. Wavell was left to scour the remnants of a peacetime imperial garrison. His troops were a patchwork collection of British regulars, Indian divisions, New Zealanders, and Australians. They were equipped with obsolete weapons, trucks that had seen better days during the First World War, and a chronic shortage of the most basic spare parts. Wavell himself was not the kind of general who inspired dramatic newspaper headlines. He was a quiet, introverted man who wore a monocle over a missing eye, lost at the Battle of Ypres in 1915. He was deeply read, a lover of poetry who would later compile an anthology of his favorite verses from memory. He did not give roaring, theatrical speeches to his men. He did not court the press. His staff officers often found him frustratingly silent, a commander who would sit through long briefings without uttering a single word, absorbing data with an analytical precision that left no room for emotional outbursts. But beneath that cold, detached exterior lay a military mind of remarkable foresight. Wavell understood that the upcoming war in the desert would not be fought like the static, trench-locked campaigns of his youth. It would be a war of pure movement. He saw the desert for what it truly was, not an obstacle, but an open ocean of sand. There were no rivers to cross, no major cities to defend, and no fixed defensive lines that could not be outflanked. In this environment, an army behaved less like traditional infantry and more like a naval fleet. Speed, mechanical reliability, and logistical endurance were the only metrics that mattered. If you ran out of water or fuel in the deep desert, you died just as surely as a sailor aboard a sinking ship. While the world watched the dramatic air battles over southern England during the summer of 1940, Wavell quietly began training his small force in the grueling art of long-range desert navigation. He forced his men to live on a single gallon of water a day, to repair complex tank tracks in blinding sandstorms, and to navigate across trackless wastes using nothing but sun compasses and the stars. He was building a highly specialized, razor-sharp instrument. He knew he would only get one chance to use it. The Italian Storm. The crisis arrived in September of 1940. It was given the deceptive, understated code name, Operation Compass. The plan was not designed as a grand campaign of conquest. It was intended as a brief, 5-day raid, a sharp tactical slap to disrupt the Italian preparations and force them back across the border. Wavell was taking a monumental gamble. To reinforce O'Connor's force, he had to strip the defenses of Egypt to the absolute bone. If the operation failed, there would be nothing left to stop the Italians from marching all the way to the Suez Canal. To ensure success, Wavell knew he had to maintain absolute secrecy. If the Italians got even a hint of what was coming, they would close the gaps between their camps and use their massive numerical superiority to crush the British advance. The security measures were draconian. Even the senior officers commanding the assault divisions were not told the true nature of the operation until a few days before the start. Troops were moved forward under the cover of darkness, their vehicles hiding in natural depressions during the day to avoid detection by Italian scout planes. Wavell even staged elaborate deceptions, leaking false reports that British forces in Egypt were being depleted to reinforce the campaigns in East Africa. He ordered dummy camps to be built near the Nile, complete with fake inflatable tanks and lighting patterns designed to mimic the presence of thousands of soldiers. The stage was set. In the freezing cold darkness of December 8, 1940, the engines of the Western Desert Force sputtered to life. The Great Raid was about to begin. The Mirage Shatters. On the morning of December 9th, the Italian garrison at the fortified camp of Nibeiwa was waking up to the smell of morning coffee and the routine sounds of camp life. They had no idea that an entire British armored division had spent the night slipping silently through the wide desert gap to their rear. Suddenly, out of the morning mist, a terrifying roar shattered the silence. It was the sound of British Matilda tanks. The Matilda was a lumbering, heavily armored beast, a moving fortress that the light Italian anti-tank guns could not pierce. The tanks charged straight through the rear gates of the camp, their machine guns sputtering and their tracks crushing everything in their path. The surprise was total. Italian officers rushed out of their tents in their pajamas, only to find British infantrymen already clearing their trenches with bayonets. Within hours, the fortified camp of Nibeiwa had fallen, its garrison killed or captured, while the British casualties were practically non-existent. Without pausing to celebrate, O'Connor's forces turned north, striking the next Italian camp from behind. The pattern repeated itself with devastating predictability. The Italian troops, though often fighting with immense personal bravery, found themselves completely helpless against a style of warfare they had never envisioned. Their fixed artillery positions were bypassed and isolated. Their communications were severed. The 5-day raid had turned into an avalanche of absolute panic. Wavell, watching the reports flood into his Cairo headquarters, realized that the Italian 10th Army was not just retreating, it was disintegrating. He gave O'Connor the green light to discard the 5-day limit. The raid was now a full-scale offensive. The British forces chased the broken remnants of Graziani's army across the western desert, sweeping past Sidi Barrani and pushing into Libya itself. The pace of the advance was breathtaking, a relentless mechanical sprint across hundreds of miles of wilderness. In January of 1941, the British struck the heavily fortified port city of Bardia. After a brutal, multi-day assault coordinated with naval gunfire from the Royal Navy, the fortress collapsed. Over 36,000 Italian soldiers surrendered in a single afternoon. Next came Tobruk, the premier deep-water port of eastern Libya. It fell in less than 48 hours, providing Wavell's overextended supply lines with a vital lifeline on the Mediterranean coast. The world looked on in absolute disbelief. A tiny British force, using trucks held together with wire and tanks that were rapidly wearing out their engines, had destroyed an army 5 times its size. But the climax of the campaign was still to come. Realizing that the British were on the verge of cutting off their entire line of retreat, the remaining Italian forces began a desperate evacuation of Cyrenaica, fleeing west along the coastal highway toward the safety of Tripoli. O'Connor made a decision of breathtaking audacity. He took his remaining tanks and a handful of infantry and plunged straight into the uncharted, boulder-strewn interior of the deep Libyan desert. They were attempting a race against time, cutting across the base of the Cyrenaican Peninsula to intercept the retreating Italian column before it could escape. For days, the men of the Coombe Force, a flying column named after its commander, John Coombe, drove through blinding sandstorms over jagged terrain that tore their tires to shreds and threatened to seize their engines. They were running on fumes, their water rations down to a few sips a day, their men utterly exhausted. On February 5, 1941, the vanguard of the British column reached the coastal village of Beda Fomm. They looked out across the road and saw exactly what they had been searching for: the lead vehicles of the massive Italian retreat. They had beaten the enemy to the punch. The trap at Beda Fomm. The battle that followed was a scene of pure claustrophobic chaos. A tiny force of fewer than 3,000 British soldiers equipped with just a few dozen functioning tanks had thrown themselves directly across the path of 20,000 desperate retreating Italians. The Italians realized they were trapped. If they could not break through this fragile British line, their entire army was finished. With the courage of desperation, Italian tanks and infantry launched assault after assault against the British positions. The sand dunes of Beda Fomm became a roaring inferno of anti-tank fire, exploding ammunition trucks, and swirling white dust. The British artillery fired over open sights, their barrels growing blisteringly hot as they raked the crowded Italian columns. The light British cruiser tanks darted in and out of the smoke, striking the flanks of the lumbering Italian medium tanks and throwing their formations into absolute confusion. For 48 hours, the scales hung in a delicate balance. The British were running dangerously low on ammunition. Their tank crews had been awake for days, their eyes bloodshot from dust and lack of sleep, their hands trembling on the controls. But the relentless pressure, the psychological shock of being intercepted from the desert interior proved too much for the Italian command. On the morning of February 7th, the remaining Italian tanks made one final desperate charge toward the British lines. They were stopped just yards from the British command post by a handful of anti-tank guns. When that final effort failed, something inside the Italian army broke. A white flag was raised from the lead vehicle. Within minutes, white sheets and rags began fluttering from thousands of trucks stretching as far as the eye could see down the coastal highway. The victory was total. The Italian 10th Army had ceased to exist. In just 2 months, Wavell's forces had advanced 500 miles, destroyed 10 full divisions, captured 130,000 prisoners, 400 tanks, and over 1,200 artillery pieces. All of this had been accomplished at the cost of fewer than 2,000 British casualties. O'Connor sent a legendary, laconic telegram back to Wavell's headquarters in Cairo. Fox killed in the open. The road to Tripoli was wide open. There were no organized Axis forces left to defend the rest of North Africa. If O'Connor's tanks kept rolling, they could have cleared the continent of fascism before the spring, fundamentally altering the entire course of the Second World War. But back in London, a different mind was looking at a different map, and it was a mind that was about to make a catastrophic strategic decision. The fateful call from Whitehall. Winston Churchill was a political leader of magnificent rhetorical power, a man whose fierce defiance had kept Great Britain alive during its darkest hour. But as a military strategist, Churchill was a man driven by romantic impulses, prone to chasing dramatic gestures at the expense of cold, logistical realities. While Wavell and O'Connor were securing their historic victory at Beda Fomm, Churchill's eyes were fixed on the Balkans. Adolf Hitler was preparing to invade Greece to rescue his stumbling Italian allies. Churchill believed that Great Britain had a moral and strategic obligation to stand by the Greeks, creating a new Balkan front that could challenge the Nazi war machine on the European continent. To build this Greek expeditionary force, Churchill made a decision that would haunt the British military for years. He ordered Wavell to halt the advance on Tripoli immediately. The Western Desert Force was to be dismantled. Its most experienced divisions, its best tanks, and its precious artillery units were to be pulled out of the front line and shipped across the Mediterranean to Greece. Wavell was a professional soldier, raised in a tradition that absolute obedience to political authority was the ultimate duty of a commander. Though his private journals reveal a deep, aching awareness of the strategic folly of the decision, he did not openly revolt. He did not threaten to resign. He quietly set about executing his prime minister's orders. Cyrenaica, the vast desert province that had just been won at such immense cost, was stripped of its defenders. In place of O'Connor's veteran, highly trained desert experts, Wavell was forced to leave behind a collection of raw, inexperienced units. The newly arrived British 2nd Armored Division was equipped with worn-out tanks that had been salvaged from the battlefields of Operation Compass. Many of their vehicles were missing vital spare parts. Their crews lacked proper training in desert navigation, and their communications equipment was obsolete. To make matters worse, O'Connor himself was recalled to Cairo to take a well-deserved rest, replaced by commanders who had no prior experience with the unique, fast-moving realities of the North African theater. Wavell believed he had time. He calculated that it would take months for the Germans or Italians to assemble enough forces in Tripoli to launch a significant counteroffensive across the desert. He was wrong. Because on February 12, 1941, a German transport plane touched down on the tarmac at Tripoli. Step onto the stage a relatively unknown German lieutenant general named Erwin Rommel, and he had no intention of waiting for the British to get ready. The arrival of the storm. Rommel had been sent to North Africa with an explicit, highly conservative brief. He was to establish a defensive barrier around Tripoli, keeping the British from driving the Axis completely out of the continent. He was given a tiny force, the vanguard of what would become the Afrika Korps, and told to avoid any reckless adventures. But Rommel, like O'Connor, was a master of the blitzkrieg. He took one look at the overextended, poorly equipped British positions in Cyrenaica and realized they were a house of cards waiting to be blown over. Without waiting for his full division to arrive, and in direct defiance of his superiors in Berlin, Rommel ordered his small force forward. The impact was immediate and devastating. In late March of 1941, Rommel's light panzers struck the British outposts at El Agila. The inexperienced British units, their tanks breaking down mechanically at every turn, found themselves completely outmaneuvered by a faster, more aggressive enemy. The British retreat rapidly turned into a full-scale rout. The hard-won gains of Operation Compass vanished in a matter of days. Rommel's forces swept across Cyrenaica like a whirlwind, bypassing the coastal towns and cutting straight through the desert interior, using the very tactics that O'Connor had pioneered just months earlier. In the midst of the chaos, disaster struck the British command structure. General O'Connor, who had been rushed back to the front by Wavell to try and restore order, was traveling in a staff car at night near Mirawa. In the darkness and confusion, his vehicle took a wrong turn and drove straight into a German reconnaissance patrol. The architect of Operation Compass was captured, spent the next several years in an Italian prisoner of war camp, and was completely removed from the desert theater at the exact moment he was most desperately needed. By mid-April, the British had been chased all the way back to the Egyptian border. The only remnant of their spectacular conquest was the port city of Tobruk, where a stubborn garrison of Australian infantry had dug themselves in, refusing to retreat and denying Rommel the vital port he needed to sustain his advance. Back in London, Churchill was in a state of absolute fury. The Greek campaign had ended in an unmitigated disaster, with British forces being evacuated from the beaches under relentless Luftwaffe attack, leaving behind all their heavy equipment. And now, the desert, the one place where British arms had tasted glorious victory, was burning down around his ears. Churchill did not look at his own decisions as the root cause of the catastrophe. He did not blame the diversion of troops to Greece, or the chronic lack of supply ships, or the mechanical unreliability of the British tanks. He blamed General Archibald Wavell. The long-distance duel. The relationship between Winston Churchill and Archibald Wavell was a study in fundamental human incompatibility. Churchill was a man of high-voltage energy, an erratic genius who thrived on drama, conflict, and constant communication. Wavell was a man of monastic silence, a professional stoic who viewed emotional hyperbole with deep professional distaste. Churchill wanted a general who would write him long, enthusiastic letters filled with bold promises and aggressive rhetoric. Wavell sent short, factual telegrams that laid out logistical problems, mechanical deficiencies, and the precise numbers of functional tank engines. To Churchill, Wavell's silence looked like defeatism. He began to refer to the general privately as a tired old man, and complained that he lacked the killer instinct necessary to win the war. In May of 1941, Churchill decided to take matters into his own hands. He ordered a special convoy, codenamed Operation Tiger, to sail straight through the dangerous waters of the Mediterranean, carrying over 200 new tanks directly to Egypt. Churchill believed that these tanks would solve all of Wavell's problems overnight. He began sending daily, increasingly impatient telegrams to Cairo, demanding that Wavell launch an immediate, massive counteroffensive to destroy Rommel and relieve the siege of Tobruk. Wavell knew the reality on the ground was far more complicated than a simple count of incoming vehicles. The tanks arrived, but they were not ready for immediate combat. They were painted in European green camouflage, requiring complete repainting for the desert terrain. They lacked specialized sand filters on their engines, meaning that if they drove into the desert wilderness, their machinery would be ruined by abrasive dust within hours. Furthermore, the tanks were a mixture of heavily armored Matildas and faster, temperamental Crusader tanks. Their crews had never worked together, their radios operated on different frequencies, and they had zero time to train as a cohesive unit. But Churchill would hear no excuses. The political pressure from London was immense, bordering on blackmail. If Wavell did not attack immediately, he would be removed from command, branded as a coward who had lost his nerve. Wavell, trapped between the military reality of his unready forces and the political demands of his prime minister, made the tragic decision to yield. He discarded his own deep-seated belief in meticulous preparation and agreed to launch a premature assault. The operation was given the aggressive, muscular name, Operation Battleaxe. It was an operation born of political desperation, and it was marching straight into a carefully prepared trap. The Carnage of Battleaxe. On the morning of June 15, 1941, The British tanks rumbled forward across the Egyptian frontier, heading toward the strategic positions around the Hellfire Pass and Sollum. Wavell's plan was simple and conventional. His heavily armored tanks would pin the German forces along the coast, while his faster cruiser tanks would sweep through the desert flank, outflanking Rommel's positions and driving him back into Libya. But Rommel was not Graziani. He did not dig himself into static, isolated camps. He had spent the preceding weeks studying the terrain and creating a revolutionary defensive doctrine that would dominate the Desert War for the next 2 years. Rommel understood that the British tank doctrine was fundamentally flawed. British armor tended to charge forward blindly, operating independently of their infantry and artillery, relying on their speed and protection to overwhelm the enemy. So Rommel did not fight tank with tank. He hid his deadliest weapons in the sand. As the British Matilda tanks charged toward the slopes of the Hellfire Pass, they suddenly found themselves under fire from a weapon they had never encountered in this role: the German 88mm anti-aircraft gun. The 88 was a massive, high-velocity weapon designed to shoot high-altitude bombers out of the sky. Rommel had ordered his crews to dig these massive guns deep into the desert floor, concealing them with camouflage nets until the British tanks were practically on top of them. The results were horrifyingly one-sided. The high-velocity shells of the 88 tore through the thick armor of the Matildas as if it were paper. Tanks exploded in sheets of orange flame, their turrets blown clean off their hulls, their crews incinerated in their seats. The Hellfire Pass became a smoking junkyard of British steel, earning the grim nickname Hellfire Pass among the traumatized survivors. Meanwhile, on the desert flank, the faster British Crusader tanks were lured into a running battle with Rommel's Panzer III and IV models. As the Crusaders rushed forward to engage, the German tanks deliberately retreated, drawing the British armor directly across the line of hidden German anti-tank screens. It was a systematic, mechanical slaughter. The British tanks were picked off one by hidden gunners they could not see, while their own short-range 2-pounder guns could not reach the enemy positions. By the third day of the operation, Wavell's armored divisions had lost over half their tanks. Their formations were shattered, their lines of communication were in chaos, and Rommel was already launching a fast-moving armored counterstroke that threatened to cut off the entire British force from their retreat into Egypt. Wavell realized that the operation was an unmitigated disaster. To save his remaining men from total annihilation, he flew out to the frontline command post himself, assessed the situation through a cloud of dust and incoming artillery fire, and gave the order to abort the offensive. Operation Battleaxe was over. It had lasted less than 72 hours. The British had lost nearly 100 tanks, while Rommel's forces remained completely intact, their positions unshaken. Wavell rumbled back to Cairo in his staff car, a silent man who knew that his career was over. He had launched an operation he knew would fail, because he lacked the political power to say no to the man at 10 Downing Street. And now, he would pay the price for it. The execution. The blow fell on June 21, 1941. Wavell was sitting at his desk in Cairo when a coded cable arrived from London. Churchill had decided to play a game of musical chairs with his imperial commanders. Wavell was officially relieved of his command of Middle East Command. He was to be replaced by General Claude Auchinleck, a forceful, respected officer from the Indian Army. To soften the blow publicly, Wavell was not dismissed from the service. Instead, he was sent to take Auchinleck's place as Commander-in-Chief in India. It was a clear, unmistakable demotion, an elegant form of political exile that pushed the silent general far away from the crucial European theater of war. Wavell accepted the news with his characteristic maddening equanimity. He did not complain to his staff. He did not leak bitter stories to the newspapers. He simply cleaned out his desk, packed his books of poetry and prepared to leave the desert he had spent a year defending. But his departure was marked by a profound, bitter irony that exposes the true injustice of his removal. As Auchinleck stepped into the Cairo headquarters, he found himself showered with the very resources that Wavell had spent months begging for in vain. The British industry was finally moving into full wartime production. Massive shipments of modern American equipment were beginning to flood into Egypt under the Lend-Lease program. Auchinleck did not have to fight with worn-out trucks and obsolete tanks. He received hundreds of new American Stuart and Grant tanks, vehicles equipped with powerful 75mm guns that could finally challenge the German panzers on equal terms. He was given massive reinforcements of fresh infantry divisions from around the empire, large wings of modern fighter aircraft, and an absolute mountain of artillery and ammunition. Furthermore, when Auchinleck himself refused to launch an immediate counteroffensive, demanding months of careful preparation to train his men with the new equipment, Churchill did not fire him out of hand. The Prime Minister was forced to wait, learning the hard way that the desert did not yield to simple political impatience. And when Auchinleck eventually stumbled against Rommel, the command would finally pass to General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery would become a global legend, the famous victor of El Alamein, his name celebrated in every history book as the man who broke the Axis in North Africa. But Montgomery would fight his battles with an overwhelming numerical and material superiority that Wavell could scarcely have dreamed of. He would have over 1,000 tanks, including the magnificent American Sherman, absolute control of the skies, and a logistical system that poured millions of gallons of fuel into his front lines every single day. Montgomery did not win his victory through superior tactical genius. He won it through the systematic, grinding application of overwhelming material power. It was the exact style of warfare that Archibald Wavell had spent his entire tenure trying to build, but was never allowed to possess. The quiet exile. Archibald Wavell's war in India and Southeast Asia would bring him little joy. He arrived just in time to face the terrifying onslaught of the Japanese Empire after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Once again, he was handed a theater that had been starved of resources, short of aircraft, short of modern weapons, and expected to hold the line with a collection of raw, untrained troops. He oversaw the painful, agonizing retreats through Malaya and Burma, enduring the bitter taste of defeat as the British imperial system collapsed across the Far East. He bore the responsibility for these disasters with the same stoic, uncomplaining silence that had defined his entire life. In 1943, he was retired from the military entirely and appointed Viceroy of India, a difficult political role that placed him at the center of India's tumultuous, painful march toward independence. He worked tirelessly to manage the horrific Bengal famine of 1943, using his military organization to distribute food to millions of starving civilians, a quiet achievement that saved countless lives but received almost no recognition in the history books back home. When the war ended in 1945, the great commanders of the Western Alliance gathered in London and Washington to receive their victory parades, their titles, and the adulation of a grateful world. Eisenhower became a legend and a president. Montgomery became a viscount and a national icon. Rommel, though dead, was immortalized in film and literature as the ultimate romantic knight of the desert waste. Archibald Wavell returned to England in 1947. He was made Earl Wavell, a polite nod to his long years of service, and settled into a quiet, obscure retirement in London. He spent his final years focusing on the things he had always loved: literature, poetry, and his family. He published his anthology, Other Men's Flowers, which became a surprise bestseller, filled with the verses he had memorized to keep his sanity during the long, lonely nights in his desert tent. He died on May 24, 1950, at the age of 67, following complications from a major abdominal operation. His funeral procession was a small, dignified affair, his casket carried down the River Thames by a handful of old comrades. He was buried in the quiet, medieval cloister of Winchester College, far away from the battlefields of Egypt and Libya. History is a narrative that is almost always written by the victors, and it is a narrative that has a deep, systemic bias toward the theatrical. It rewards the commanders who wore unique uniforms, who gave unforgettable quotes to the press, and who had the good fortune to command at the moment when the factories were full and the enemy was starving. It easily forgets the men who did the invisible work, the lonely work, the dirty work of holding the line when the nation stood completely alone. Archibald Wavell was the general who won the desert's first, most spectacular battles. He built the foundation of tactical knowledge that would eventually defeat the Afrika Korps. He proved that a small, highly disciplined professional force could humiliate an empire. And then he was broken by the very system he served, his victory sacrificed for a political mistake, and his reputation discarded to shield the mistakes of his masters. His story is not a legend of glorious, unblemished triumph. It is a story of a professional soldier who knew how to win, knew how to suffer, and knew that in the end, the work mattered far more than the memory.